Hi, in this video, I'm going to show you how to debug this error, which is if you have issue authenticating with GitHub in Eclipse. Now, if you've tried to clone a Git repository from GitHub, it means you have to log into GitHub, access the repository, and then it will copy and clone it, bring a copy of that repository to your local machine. If you've encountered this issue, it means you haven't been able to authenticate or reach the repository. Now, you might have an incorrect URL or no network connection, but I have my Wi-Fi working correctly, and I'm pretty sure I put the right URL in. And if I close this, I can see that I had either an invalid password or a missing SSH key. With GitHub, in the past, it supported password authentication, but starting in mid-2021, they moved to not allowing password authentication, and you need an SSH key or you have to generate a personal token. We're going to talk about how to use the SSH key solution since it's a more general and long-term solution to this problem. And we'll let you authenticate with or without a password as you choose. So to generate this SSH key and log in, we need to stop trying to clone it, and we need to set up a key. Now, as a reminder, you should be in the Git repository perspective. You can manage your different perspectives up here. You typically program the Java perspective. And if you don't know where the Git repository is, the Git perspective is, so here it's gone, you can find it by going to Window, Perspective, Open Perspective, Other, and then selecting the Git option from the perspectives. And this will open up this view. Now, you don't need to be in this view right now, but you can be in it. It doesn't really matter because the next step is to add an SSH key. So we go to Preferences, and in Preferences, you can see I've made my way to the SSH2 option. So if we close the tree, this is found in your preferences under General and then under Network Connections. And you click on SSH2 and that brings you to this screen. You'll want to go to Key Management, and we're going to need to generate an RSA key. So what this does, I've just created a new key. This will allow me to authenticate in GitHub by copying this public key and giving it to GitHub. Now, it's okay for me to show you this public key because that's what it is, a public key. It has a corresponding private key, which I'm not going to show you. And what happens is if everyone wants to know whether this is my machine or whether I want to authenticate, I share my public key to anyone. If you know what the public key is, you can give me a query, and I can answer that query correctly only if I have the private key that corresponds to the public key. So I'm going to want to save this private key for future use. You could give it a passphrase if you want to have a password, if you have a shared computer, or if you're extra cautious about security, you could put in a passphrase down here. I'm not too concerned about this, so I'm going to say OK. I'm going to go with no passphrase, which means I don't need to type in a password to be able to authenticate with my GitHub. You give it a name. Now, I already have an ID RSA file, so you could just leave it as is, but I'm going to give this ID RSA MSCI240 in case you want a specific one. Or you could say ID RSA GitHub, for example. And this means that it successfully saved these. The private key is stored in one file, ID RSA MSCI240, the file name you gave, and the public key has the same file name with a .pub. And so if you ever want to reuse this, you can go to this file, copy the key there, the public key, and paste everything into wherever it is you want to authenticate. Awesome. So I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to go over to GitHub. Now here I am on GitHub. I'm on the repository page, but to do this, I'll need to go to Settings. So I am in my student account, which is Oceanide2, and I'm going to scroll down to Settings. And here you want to go to SSH and GPG keys. Now here you can see I've generated an SSH key, a public key for Codio. So we want to do the same thing, but we have to do it manually for Eclipse. In this case, I go to SSH key. This is going to be MSCI240. This is just to remind you, Eclipse. And I'm actually going to say Oliver MacBook Pro 13, just to remind me which machine. If you have multiple machines, you might need to do this multiple times since it's stored on your local machine. And you paste in the entire thing. It has to begin with this SSH RSA and go all the way through, so all of the text. And you click Add SSH key. So now I have two keys. I've got my Codio one, which we've already set up automatically, and we've got this one. And you can even see when it was last used if you need to. Great. So now that you have this, we're going to go back to our repositories. So you click on the GitHub home page to go here, and you can find your repository right here. So we're going to want to check this out. Here you've got the SSH option because we're going to use SSH as the protocol to clone the repository. We don't want to have HTTPS or the command line interface. If you know how to use these, you're welcome to, but I'm going to show just the SSH option. So you copy this as you did before, and you switch back over to Eclipse. We're done here, so we're going to apply and hit OK, and then we're going to clone a Git repository. Now it's automatically populated this. You could paste in if there's nothing there. And we're going to give it the SSH protocol. If you leave it alone, it'll probably solve it on its own, but I'm going to be extra careful. I click Next, and you can see it is authenticated. So now you can click Next again, and you can say where it's going to store the repository. And here it's stored under a Git folder, but you might save it somewhere else. And that's how you do this. When you say Finish, it will open up, and you'll have access to what you created right here. You have different branches. You've got the ones local and remote, and we can cover this more in class. Thank you so much.